Okay, I think we'll get started right now. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Jani Bremi, and I am the director at the Sridhar Ramphal Center for International Trade Law Services, Trade Law Policy and Services at the University of the West Indies at the Cape campus. And I'm very pleased to welcome you together with my co-host from Newcastle University, Dr. Andrea Wilkinson, who will be introducing herself a little bit later on in our opening. This course on trade and the blue economy was conceived out of interest from Andrea and myself, who have a real interest in understanding the dynamics linking the blue economy, which is a burgeoning new area in international governance and international trade, and thinking concretely about ways in which it connects to the ongoing WTO agenda. For those of you who follow trade, it would have come as maybe something of a surprise that finally the negotiators in Geneva were able to agree the fisheries subsidies agreement in July this year. And so that piqued our interest even further in thinking about specifically how trade intersects with this interesting new blue economy, especially for the smaller islands of the Caribbean. So over the next week, we have the privilege of welcoming expert practitioners, academic thinkers, thought leaders on this very topic. And once we're finished with this in opening ceremony, we will definitely go through the agenda with you, and we hope that you'll be able to stay with us for most of the, if not the entirety of the week. Without further ado, I'd really like to welcome with us today some of our main collaborators on this project. First on the agenda, we have some introductory remarks from Dr. Didicus Jules, who is the Director General of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, based in St. Lucia, but serving all of the smaller islands of the Eastern Caribbean. And he's particularly important, and the OECS Commission is particularly important because they have financed a lot of the short courses under the Trade.com 2 project that we at the SRC have been privileged enough to be able to host over the last 18 months. And so without further ado, I'm going to allow Dr. Jules to start his opening welcome remarks.
Warm greetings to distinguished participants at this launch and to the leadership of the Sridhar Ramphal Center. I would first like to extend appreciation and commendation to Dr. Jani Bremi, as well as her predecessor, Mr. Neil Paul, and the team of the SRC for their warm collaboration with the OECS Commission and their willingness to seize the opportunity to work with us in offering customized graduate level training for trade officials of our member states under the OACPS EU TradeCom project. This has been a truly path-breaking initiative that has opened the road to global offerings by SRC in this area of specialization. I have been advised that about 180 professionals from over 40 countries are now registered for this new program. It was Charles Darwin who advised, and I quote, that it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one that is most adaptable to change. And in an increasingly globalized world, where there has been accelerated transformation in every aspect of our society, change is considered the one constant, and agility is the necessary response. This has been demonstrated throughout history, as we have been experiencing continuous technological, geopolitical, and environmental shifts. As a result, the societal race to keep up with the changing tides has long begun, and the stakes are very high. In the context of our small island developing states, The saga in our developmental journey of trying to keep up with the rest of the world continues. Coupled with our small size, economic structural disadvantages, high dependence on imports, vulnerability to natural disasters and external shocks, we have experienced significant developmental challenges. These challenges have been further exacerbated by the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. The footprints of what is now considered an endemic now silently stalk in our region. Winston Churchill stated, "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, but an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." And we have looked for the opportunities buried in the bowels of our difficulties. And we are seeking to use them as a catapult to economic prosperity. Covering more than 72% of the Earth's surface, the global ocean serves a variety of purposes, all critical to the sustenance and preservation of human life. It provides oxygen, a medium for transportation, seaborne trade, mitigate climate change, and contributes towards food security, job creation, and recreation. As a result, this sector has emerged as a substantial driver of global GDP and is seen as the next economic frontier. The World Bank for itself describes the blue economy as, I quote, "the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improve livelihoods and jobs, while preserving the health of ocean ecosystems." The ocean is of even greater relevance to the OECS region and by extension the wider Caribbean, as our countries are defined by the ocean. Connected by this shared resource, the OECS region is endowed with ocean space significantly larger, over 84% larger than our landmass. Given our vast ocean resource, utilizing the blue economy through traditional and emerging sectors provides an ideal avenue to transition our economies from small island states to large ocean states. It has even greater significance for trade, which is an important dimension of our economies. Notwithstanding the immense opportunities that this sector provides, the blue economy, however, is under significant threat. Acidification, pollution, ocean warming, fisheries collapse, and climate change are just some of the threats towards the blue economy. Climate change has emerged as one of the biggest challenges facing our world, and a global call was made to combat the negative effects associated with climate change. In 2015, all UN member states developed a policy on sustainability. Goal 14, Life Below Water, is a universal call to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, the sea, and marine resources for sustainable development through institutional and legal frameworks. This course that is being launched further solidifies our commitment towards ensuring the sustainable development of our blue economy. It is important that we understand the sector so that the necessary policies can be instituted and so that we can identify other areas within the sector that we can tap into. I commend the Sridhar Ramphal Center for taking the lead on such an important and timely course, and equally for making it accessible to all. They continue to be a strategic development partner within our region, and we at the OECS look forward to continued future collaboration. I implore you, the participants, to take full opportunity of this course and gain as much knowledge as possible. You are our future leaders, our future negotiators, our future advisors. The future of the blue economy and the region depends on you. Best wishes in your course.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jules, OECS Director General. Some really interesting and inspiring words to start us off on the right track for this inaugural course on trade and the blue economy. Without further ado, let me move on to the Deputy Principal of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, Professor Winston Moore, one of my bosses, who will also add his welcome remarks. Over to you, Professor.
Co-Chair Dr. Janice Remy, Director of the Sridhar Ramphal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services. Our second co-chair, Dr. Andrea Wilkinson, co-director, Global Challenges Academy, Newcastle University. Ambassador Stephen Faber, Senior Advisor, WTO Director General. Dr. Didicus Jules, Director General of the OECS. Professor Richard Davies, Pro Vice Chancellor Global, Newcastle University. Our lecturers, specially invited guests, students, good day to you all. I bring greetings on behalf of the Principal and Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor Clive Landis, as well as the rest of senior management staff at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. I want to start first by congratulating the organizers of this very innovative course and collaboration on trade and the blue economy, the Sridhar Ramphal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services of the University of West Indies, as well as Newcastle University. This collaboration brings together the best minds from these institutions to offer a course that will support sustainable development, as well as help the region leverage all that the blue economy has to offer. The collaboration also addresses an area of tremendous importance to the Caribbean, trade and the blue economy. This is an area that has always been central to the Caribbean development, from the early years of shipping sugar to Europe to the present era of coastal and marine tourism. It's not an overstatement to say that trade and the blue economy are fundamental to the economies of the Caribbean. As a premier university in the Caribbean, we have the region's development as a key part of our strategic plan, at the core of which is the use of our resources and capabilities to revitalize Caribbean development. Through higher education, we help communities to build capacity and nurture the values and attitudes needed to support more resilient and sustainable pathways to development. It's on this basis that we continuously seek to equip Caribbean leaders and technical managers in the public and private sector, civil society, and development institutions with the knowledge and skills to advance the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals across the region. Courses like these are an important part of helping the region to decouple economic growth from biodiversity loss. Two concepts in relation to decoupling are important. Relative decoupling, which means that GDP grows faster than resource use, and absolute decoupling, which means that resource use declines in absolute terms when GDP grows. Decoupling requires policy interventions to achieve this objective. These include moratoria or caps on resource extraction in highly sensitive biodiverse regions, as well as restrictions on construction in certain areas. The Barbados Green Economy Scoping Study also noted that these goals can be supported by the establishment of a SIDS knowledge transfer hub, which will provide opportunities for SIDS to learn from best practices in each country and leverage funding to support sustainable development goals. The invaluable contributions of our speakers present today are sincerely appreciated by the UWI and the larger Caribbean region, as we recognize that not only do they possess a scientific and practical expertise within their fields, but they also bring a fresh and much needed point of view that can enhance the effectiveness of managing our oceans for a sustainable future. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that you will enjoy this course, and I'm looking forward to you taking the things you have been exposed to back to your places of work and actively lobbying for the sustainable use of our oceans. Thank you very much.
And thanks to you also, Professor Moore. I wonder if the speaker view on. Making sure that the speaker view is on. Not sure how this is coming across, but thank you so much for these words. They were very inspiring, and I know that you do a lot of your technical work in the area of the green economy and the blue economy. So really excited to have you open up our course as well. Let me turn now to our co-collaborators on this course from Newcastle University. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Richard Davies. He is the Pro-Vice Chancellor for the Global Affairs at Newcastle, and he will also deliver some welcome remarks.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. And my name is Professor Richard Davies. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Global at Newcastle University. And it's with great enthusiasm that I welcome you all to this opening ceremony for the Trade and Blue Economy short course. I'd like to start by just extending a special word of thanks to our partner in this event, the University of the West Indies. We have a long working relationship with the University of the West Indies through our School of Natural and Environmental Sciences. So it's very fitting that we're partnering with them to deliver the course. I'd also like to thank all our co-presenters and co-partners, including the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, the World Trade Organization, the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism Secretariat, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, ambassadors and other academic partners, and also, of course, our academics at Newcastle University. Your willingness to share your expertise and experiences working in this field will be immensely beneficial to all of the participants. As you've already heard, oceans cover over 70% of the Earth's surface, and they are home to 80% of all life on the planet. They provide food, minerals, energy resources that we need to survive and to sustain livelihoods, nurture a wealth of biodiversity, and they generate 50% of the oxygen we need and absorb 25% of all carbon dioxide. In fact, my own research is on oceans, so I understand how critically important they are and how sensitive they will be and are being during climatic change. But despite this, our oceans are facing unprecedented threats due to anthropogenic activity. The need to manage our oceans sustainably has never been more important as it is today, as detailed by the need for Sustainable Development Goal 14, Life Below Water, and more recently through a call to action at the UN Oceans Conference that took place in Portugal of this year. The conference sought to propel much needed science-based innovation solutions aimed at starting a new chapter of the global ocean action. At its heart, the UN SDG agenda seeks to transform the world and recognizes that universities will be critical agents for powerful change around these UN SDG goals. So whether it be through our research or our curricula, empowering and energizing graduates, or through providing lifelong learning courses like this one today, we're absolutely committed to this agenda, and we've been brought together in a shared commitment to make a change. This year, the university, Newcastle University, is proud to be ranked first in the United Kingdom and 8th in the world in the 2022 Times Higher Educational Impact Rankings. These rankings are based upon around the UN SDG goals. And the fact we're doing so well is because it's simply in our DNA to make a difference, to make a practical difference. And of course, this includes Sustainable Development Goal number 14. We have incredible academic excellence in water research spanning over 7 decades and are currently leading on 2 of the 12 global research hubs set up by the UK government through UKRI, UK Research Innovation, around water sustainability and security and sustainable development and living deltas. These prestigious hubs enable us to deliver a coordinated global response with UK researchers working in partnership with researchers elsewhere, governments, NGIs, community groups, and international agencies across the globe. Each of the two hubs has the potential to transform the quality of life for multiple people across the world and safeguard our planet for the future. So making a difference is something our university really does deeply believe in. And it's not surprising we're ranked so highly by external agencies in the accomplishments that we've made to date. We're also committed to strengthening our work in small island developing states, recognizing their unique challenges and extreme vulnerability to climate change. So lastly, everyone, please do enjoy the course. I want to add my thanks for everyone who's involved and to you for your commitment, interest and passion for this area of research and policy making, as it is so important that we work on this for a sustainable future for all of us and for generations that follow us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor, and congratulations on attaining such heights in the Times Higher Education and for regaling us with some of the collaboration that exists already between the University of the West Indies and the Newcastle University. And I know we will be working closely together in the future and look forward to your visit to the University of the West Indies. Just to also add our own accolades that we at the University of the West Indies are also highly ranked among the top in the Caribbean and the top 1% in the Caribbean and Latin America under the same Times Higher Education. So I believe we're both in very pleasant company, and I really look forward to us working closely together. So thank you for your show of support.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So last but by no means least, let me welcome Ambassador Stephen Favrier, who is a senior advisor to the WTO Director General, and who has in his previous life served as the ambassador to the WTO from the OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And I know that he's one of those who has been and continues to fly the blue economy flag at the WTO and everywhere that he goes. He's one of the persons who I know has been really promoting this agenda. So without further ado, over to you, Ambassador, to give your opening remarks on behalf of the WTO and your DG.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Remy, Director General Didicus Jules, Professor Winston Moore, Professor Richard Davis, and you, Dr. Janive Remy. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, one and all. The oceans economy is about the sustainable use of the world's oceans resources. It is about intergenerational equity. It is about natural capital and the preservation of biodiversity. But also, the oceans economy is about trade. In one form or another, trade in oceans resources contributes between 3 to 6 trillion to global GDP, supporting the livelihoods of over 3 billion people globally. Due to the pandemic, trade in oceans-related goods fell by about 3.2% in 2020 compared to 2019, faring rather better than both world trade in goods, which dropped by 5.3%, and trade in oceans-related services, which collapsed by 74%, largely due to the shutdown of the tourism sector. Globally, more than 150 million direct jobs depend on the sound management and sustainable production, exports, imports, and consumption of ocean-based goods and services. These jobs are found in the fishing, aquaculture, shipping, coastal tourism, offshore wind energy, and marine biotechnology sectors. In a real sense, the oceans economy contributes to food security and livelihoods. And yet the oceans are under severe threat from human activity. For small island developing states currently responding to the polycrisis of COVID, climate, and cost of living, and in some cases, the food insecurity crisis, the oceans presents an unmatched opportunity to at once benefit from untapped resources while preserving marine biodiversity. But for many developing countries, in particular, small island developing states, accessing the value of the oceans can be daunting. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the main challenges to coastal developing states in benefiting from the oceans include: one, limited capacity by national stakeholders to identify and harness opportunities arising from sustainable oceans-based sectors. Two, the lack of shared vision, coordination mechanisms, and cooperation among stakeholders. Three, significant trade barriers, including high tariffs and tariff peaks, complex non-tariff measures such as private standards relevant to products and services in ocean-based economic sectors. And four, the limited legal and institutional frameworks for the sustainable governance of oceans in accordance with the International Legal Framework for Oceans as set out in the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS, and applicable and related instruments. Let me be clear, the WTO can play a meaningful role in addressing the challenges of access to the oceans economy. While the WTO does not specifically have a program on oceans economy, the multilateral trading system has a key role to play in unlocking the value and opportunity of those sectors that contribute to the oceans economy. At the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, ministers agreed rules that prohibit the use of fisheries subsidies that target IUU fishing and other measures that will curtail the over $20 billion in fishery subsidies that contribute to harmful fishing practices. This result is a major step forward for SDG 14 and has set the basis for negotiators to take forward a second wave of disciplines that will aim to unlock even more rigorous disciplines. Separately, over 70 WTO members are engaged in trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, which are focused on identifying future work to help the WTO really address sustainable development challenges and possible environmental sustainability actions and deliverables. These discussions include a dialogue with the business community, civil society, and other international organizations and academic institutions like your institutions. These efforts seek to complement and support the work of other WTO committees and bodies such as the Committee on Trade and Environment. While these discussions do not specifically look at the oceans economy, the exploration of themes such as environmental goods and services, as well as the challenges that hinder the ability of developing countries, like those of CARICOM, from maximizing benefits of environmental goods and services, can be critical in catalyzing trade in goods and services that positively impact on the sustainability of our oceans. Therefore, this course, facilitated by the Sridhar Rampal Center and Newcastle University, is very timely and will help explore how the oceans economy can be a driver for sustainable development in the OECS and CARICOM. Finally, allow me to especially congratulate Dr. Genevieve Remy and Dr. Andrea Wilkinson for putting on this course, and to all of you who have registered. I wish you a very successful and enriching program and a good balance of the day. I thank you.
Excellent opening remarks, Ambassador, giving us what I think was a really comprehensive view of where this blue economy sits and fits within the broader scheme of the WTO and trade rules. which is actually a great point of departure for us. I think, as you mentioned, there's not as yet any working agenda on the oceans economy, but in a fragmented way, the rules do address aspects of it, as you mentioned, the fisheries agreement and possibly an environmental goods agreement. So we're looking forward to hearing so much more from that, and we look forward also to the WTO developing perhaps the oceans agenda, and we're going to hear more from the WTO later on this week. So thank you very much for your time. I think this brings to a close what I thought was a brilliant overview by our welcome speakers of the value of the course, what we hope we'll be able to learn over the next week. And without further ado, I'd really like to pass over the mic to my co-host, Dr. Andrea Wilkinson, who will explain to you, the audience, a little bit about what you have in store over the next week, a little bit about who you are and where you're from, and then we will start in earnest with our agenda. So over to you, Dr. Wilkinson.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here, 1 second. So firstly, I just want to say thank you to our partner, the University of the West Indies. It's been fantastic working together and creating this course. To all of our speakers and our presenters this week who are joining us from around the globe to share their expertise with us, and also to everyone for coming today. I think it's the number of people that we've had, the interest in trade. So just briefly to introduce myself, and then I'll move on to who's here and a little bit about what we'll be covering this week. So my name is Andrea Wilkinson, and I'm co-director of the Global Challenges Academy at Newcastle University, and also a researcher in trade, climate change, and small island developing states. So my particular interest is, I'll just move along here a little bit, is small island developing states. I've a background in working towards the Sustainable Development Goals in both the blue and the green economy, working with farmers and with people with the blue economy. And more recently, I've been looking at how trade facilitation can support countries following a natural disaster, with a specific focus on small island developing states. Passionate about what I'm passionate about in my work is partnerships. And it's one of the Sustainable Development Goals, number 17. And I think what we've shown today here is coming together within that partnership, within a wider partnership, and working together towards a common goal. And we've seen over the years with COVID and with climate change that these global challenges across continents, the world's key challenges, then we need to come together. So the multi-stakeholder partnerships are crucial in order for us to move forward with this. So I'm really pleased that we've got so many people from around the globe attending this week. We've got over 200 participants from 55 different countries throughout the globe. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's fantastic that so many people are here. And just so you know that we're also recording this so it can be available for some of our participants who were interested from different time zones, then they can access that afterwards as well. But we have a whole mix of people. We have students, policymakers, lawmakers, government officials, practitioners. We have some people that would want to learn more about the blue economy and trade, and also people who are already working and making a difference in this area. So welcome to all of you. We're looking forward to hearing your comments in the comment section this week, and hopefully interacting. And I've got no doubt that you're going to have a great experience with some great speakers lined up during the week. So just to give a short rundown of what we're covering this week. So we've obviously just had the opening ceremony, and that's going to be covered afterwards by a couple of our academics, both from the University of the West Indies and from Newcastle University, who are going to be talking about the basics of the blue economy and looking at the ecological and management considerations, biodiversity aspects. So that's going to get us started today. And then tomorrow, again, same time, we're going to be here. We're going to be looking at the intersection of the blue economy, looking at with a specific focus of small island developing states and the Sustainable Development Goal agendas. And then following that, we'll be moving on to the management and legal regimes. And then on Wednesday, we'll be looking at the blue economy with its intersection and trade rules. So we've got colleagues from the World Trade Organization joining us, talking about the fisheries agreement that we've already heard about earlier. That was a momentous kind of agreement that was signed this year. That was, I believe, 10 years in the making, and what implications that has for small island developing states. Then on Thursday, we're going to look at some cross-cutting issues regarding trade and the blue economy. And then we've got a case study section following that. So again, we've got a number of people coming together to talk about specific case studies, mainly relating to the Caribbean. And then on Fridays, our last day, we will be looking at the commercializing export opportunities and a closing ceremony. And there's going to be opportunities throughout the week for you to ask any questions in the chat section. So we look forward to getting to know you and seeing how this course develops together. So we've got some incredible speakers, but I also know from our registrations that we've got some incredible participants, and we can't wait to hear from all of you also. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that wonderful introduction. We hope it's gotten your appetite wet. I am, as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Janice Remy, and I am the director at the Sridhar Ramphal Center right here at the Cave Hill campus. And I'm just really, before we start in earnest, I'm just really, really happy that we have so many collaborators with us and co-hosting institutions. I mentioned already that Andrea Wilkinson and I have put this course together, but it really has been made possible through the kind support of the OA CPS TradeCom project that has been made possible through donations and funds given to us by the OECS. We also have the WTO Chairs program at the WTO. I'm a WTO Chair for Barbados, UNCTAD, as well as the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, as well as all the other speakers that you will see from our agenda from a number of organizations. I think we will share with you, we have shared through an email, we have shared the agenda, but on that agenda and outline, you will see the basic rationale and the goals of the course. We also have some select readings that you will find useful. It's not required, but certainly readings that you will find helpful in further elucidating some of the material that the speakers will share. And then finally, we have the agenda. Hopefully later on in the week, we'll be able to share more detailed bios of our speakers as we get them, as well as the PowerPoint presentation. Finally, just as a housekeeping matter, you'll notice that this is being delivered in the form of a webinar, which means that there will not be an opportunity, unfortunately, for questions and answers through an oral format. This is because of the number of participants who registered for the course, which greatly exceeded our expectations. And just for management and security purposes, we've had to keep it in that format. But we hope that that is not going to in any way dull your enthusiasm in asking questions. We have alerted the speakers to the possibility that you may have questions throughout the duration of their presentations, but what we will do after each main presentation is give you an opportunity to write any questions. And at the end of the entire segment, maybe we'll ask both of the speakers to join for any sort of cross-cutting questions that may have come out or come up during the course of the presentations. So without further ado, let me start by welcoming our first speaker. As you probably can see, we've organized the first sessions to get a little bit into the background and into the science of the blue economy, understanding sort of what it is that we're talking about, what are the threats that are being posed from a biodiversity, a climate change, deterioration perspective. And then we will move into the Caribbean, because the course is really aimed at looking more specifically at the blue economy and the challenges and opportunities from the perspective of the smaller islands, in particular the Caribbean. So our first speaker, I'm very happy to introduce, is our Professor of Conservation Science and Policy at Newcastle University, Professor Phil McGowan, who has worked for many years in international species conservation, initially carrying out field work on threatened species, particularly Galliformes, pheasants and relatives in mountains, tropical forests and grasslands of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. He has worked with a large international network of field workers and conservation practitioners and carried out a range of capacity development and conservation planning programs designed to increase the effectiveness of actions to reduce pressures on threatened Galliformes, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He joined Newcastle University in 2013 and is now engaged in evidence-based species conservation that looks more broadly and systematically at species research to inform policy. He is chair of the IUCN SSC post-2020 Biodiversity Targets Task Force that has contributed to species aspects of the negotiations on the global biodiversity framework. So no one better to open us up than Professor McGowan to give us that sort of broader perspective of what's at stake really from a scientific, biodiversity, and ultimately management perspective. So over to you, Professor. I understand you have some slides. Please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction and welcome, Jan. Yeah, so in this first session, understanding the basics, for me, and Jan has indicated what my background is. To me, the basics are really understanding what is the natural resource, what are the resources that we're talking about in this blue economy. So I'm really going to have a little bit of a look at some of, not all of, but some of the global policy landscape and beginning to consider how we can assess the impacts of economic activity on biodiversity. So that's kind of the baseline, and I'll give you an indication in a couple of slides' time as to why I think that underpins everything that we should be thinking about with the blue economy. So just a little bit about me. Jan's given some indications of my experience. I am Professor of Conservation Science and Policy at Newcastle. As Richard Davies said, we take the UN Sustainable Development Goals very seriously, and I chair the university's committee, which is a subcommittee of our University Executive Board. I co-direct the Newcastle University Centre for Climate and Environmental Resilience, which is a relatively new virtual centre which stretches across all three faculties here in the university, trying to bring together the natural science, the social science, humanities and medical science research and curriculum development that we have in climate and environmental resilience. Outside the university, as Jan said, I chair the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Species Survival Commission Task Force, looking to inform and input into the Convention on Biological Diversity and their negotiations for a new global framework. And I also co-chair the Association of Commonwealth Universities, Higher Education and the SDGs Network. So there's a couple of pictures there indicating my only experience in the Caribbean is one of these Galliformes, which Jan did pronounce so perfectly. The Powin, the Trinidad piping guan, is one of those Galliformes and involved in leading and facilitating the production of a strategic conservation plan for the recovery of that species over a year ago with colleagues at the St Augustine campus of UWI. So I'll start by setting out a little bit of global policy context, and this is really three instruments. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are three, really I'm going to consider three of the Sustainable Development Goals, 13, 14, and 15. And they're all coming increasingly into sharp focus at this time of year. COP27, the 27th Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is meeting next month in Egypt. The following month, in December, the Convention on Biological Diversity is meeting. What should have been COP15 in Kunming in China is going to be COP15 in Montreal in Canada because of the challenges of traveling to Kunming. And that convention of the Conference of the Parties is really, really important. I'll talk a little bit about the importance of 2020 and the conclusion of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity's last strategic plan. And so 2 years in the making has been a new global framework, which this time the CBD hopes will last for several decades. So negotiating on what the parameters of this framework might be is very, very important. So that first, in fact, 3 weeks, there is those 2 weeks, the 12 days of the Conference of the Parties, that's preceded by another 3 days of technical discussions to try and get this global biodiversity framework agreed and finalized. So the first 3 weeks of December are going to be absolutely critical for the global policy context around biodiversity. And I'll indicate why that's particularly important. But I'll start with the Sustainable Development Goals, which have already been mentioned 3 or 4 times, adopted by every single UN member state in September 2015 and agreed to run up until 2013. So if we think of it in sort of sports terms, say football terms, we're coming up to half time. And so it really is time now for us to consider what lessons we've learned and how we can really improve our game in the second half. How do we really step up? Richard mentioned the importance of universities to this agenda. But one thing that the Association of Commonwealth Universities is particularly concerned about, or draws attention to, I should say, is the fact that of altogether 169 targets in these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, only one of them, 4.7, explicitly mentions higher education. Yet clearly, as Richard indicated, we're fundamental to achieving many of the targets in all of the goals through our research, through our education, and through the impact, the way that we engage with business, with civil society, with governments, and with local communities. So the Sustainable Development Goals is very, very important context. In my view, it's particularly important for this agenda that we're talking about now, for our natural resources, because it has 2 goals in there that are explicitly about our natural world, 14 and 15. Prior to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, biodiversity, whether underwater or on land, was often seen as something different. It was put to one side, but we can increasingly see how it is fundamental to our development as people and as our economy. Really also very evident by the World Economic Forum listing biodiversity loss as one of the 3 great risks that we face. Their global risk register, risk report that they produce every year, has had climate change there for a number of years and is increasingly recognizing the change to our natural environment as a significant risk to the globe. And this is a way I think is very, very helpful in thinking of the difference in the relationship between the different Sustainable Development Goals. We're all striving for economic development, and there are a number of goals, 4 goals, that are about sustainable development of our economy. In order for that economy to develop sustainably, it needs to be based on an equitable society. We want a fair society in which the work and the benefits are shared equally. And there are a number of goals that are all concerned with having an equitable and sustainable society. But underpinning all of this is the natural world that we live in and live on and are a part of. And there are 4 goals, the 3 that I've mentioned, climate action, life below water and life on land, as well as clean water and sanitation, that are fundamental to the robust planet that we need in order to have a healthy society so that our economy can develop in a sustainable way. And then running through all of these, as Andrew indicated, is this partnerships for the goals. We need to talk to each other, we need to communicate, and we need to share the expertise and the challenges that we all have. So I think it's a wonderful, emotive way of showing how these sustainable goals are all rooted in our environment. I'm just going to have a little bit more of a look at two of these sustainable development goals. Huge apologies if you're very familiar with this, but given the diversity of participants, it might be helpful just to have a little bit of a look at the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, just to see how it is structured. So the goals are all got underneath them and differing numbers of targets. In these two biodiversity targets, there are biodiversity goals, there are quite a lot of targets. If you look at the energy sustainable development goal, it only has 3 targets underneath it, but those targets are very much all encompassing and broad brush. It's absolutely critical to remember with the goals, the wording of the goals, these little strap lines we've got, life below water, are only part of the whole goal that has been negotiated. But the goal and the targets are politically negotiated. So there might be words in there or phrases that you think, oh, well, that might duplicate something that's over here, or that's not quite consistent with what's there. And it's because it is politically negotiated. So different UN member states will have different things that they think are very important and will want to see in these targets. So do remember that they are politically negotiated. You'll see in here a number of them. I mentioned at the beginning that the wording, that the agenda runs up to 2030. Some of these for biodiversity have got 2020 dates in there. And that is because of the relationship with the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that the previous strategic plan lasted from 2011 to 2020. And so once the new framework, the Global Biodiversity Framework is adopted, it will be interesting to see how those dates, what the wording changes, if it does, with these Sustainable Development Goals, or whether they just, in fact, agree that, in essence, the wording is fine and we'll just change those dates to 2030. But we'll wait to see what happens there. You can already see at the bottom there, 14.7 has got explicit mention of small island developing states and economic benefits from the sustainable use of marine resources, essentially capturing a number of the issues in the context that we'll be considering during this week. So having a look at a couple of these targets in more detail, you can see really bringing out the fact that you can see they are the result of negotiation, effectively regulating harvesting and ending overfishing, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, words that are absolutely central to a lot of work that the Food and Agriculture Organization does and Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, ending destructive fishing practices, implement science-based management plans in order to restore fish stocks. So you can see in those there is management, there is science, there is working with communities outside science and government as well, cross-sectoral working. And for life on land, take urgent and significant action to reduce the degradation of natural habitats, halt the loss of biodiversity, and by 2020 protect and prevent the extinction of threatened species. And I'll come on a little bit more to some of the work that we need to understand what it is we have to do if we are going to protect species and prevent the extinction of those the most threatened. But both of those give a flavour of how much cross-sectoral work is needed if we are going to achieve these Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So we've done a little bit of pilot work here at Newcastle, looking at the challenges that small island developing states have identified in their voluntary national reports to SDGs. And all this graphic on the right does is show just how different each state considers its challenges. So a number of the states there have picked challenges across many, if not all, of the Sustainable Development Goals. But look at St. Lucia, for example, which is the second one down in that middle block. There are a relatively small number of challenges that have been identified in its voluntary national report to the UN High-Level Political Forum. Relatively few Sustainable Development Goals have been identified. It's not to say that the others aren't important, but those are seen those as the real priorities. But what I think is very striking is that given, and we heard the phrase used in the opening words, large ocean states, it is quite interesting that quite a number of small island developing states don't seem to have given a huge priority to life below water, which is really interesting, and certainly life on land. And we increasingly know from a biodiversity point of view that there isn't a line at the shoreline, at the coast, marking marine biodiversity from terrestrial biodiversity. So when we are talking about these systems, they are interlinked, particularly where, and the really interesting stat about the percentage of ocean compared with the land mass. So where you've got small islands, a small land mass, there is very little distinction between the ecosystem, whether it's on land or in the ocean. So there's a lot of interactions between those. So worth reflecting perhaps a little bit on the difference in priority that these small island developing states that had up to last year submitted voluntary national reports, the importance that they have identified in their own countries for meeting these Sustainable Development Goals. So I'd like to have a look a little bit more now at the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and to draw out and show why these current negotiations are so important, and hopefully they will feed into the if there is any revision or change, or just a change in the narrative around the Sustainable Development Goals. The name of the convention is Biological Diversity. It's one of the 3 conventions that were negotiated at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, along with the convention, the Climate Convention, but obviously climate is almost like the older sibling now, even though they were both negotiated at the same time. It is about biological diversity, but reflecting the global perspectives on biodiversity. It has 3 main objectives. One of them is about conservation. One of them is about sustainable use, reflecting the fact that large parts of the world think biological diversity is not there to be put to one side, to be liked and admired, but it's part and parcel of everyday use. And then an increasingly challenging issue globally as we move into and live in a much more interconnected and globalized world is the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. Increasingly, as the convention matures, we can see that some of those challenges are not just about the utilization of genetic resources. Those are what drove this, but it's the fair and equitable sharing of a whole host of benefits arising from data, arising from knowledge. There are many ways in which we have to pursue fair and equitable sharing of the benefits. So all those 3 objectives are absolutely critical and part of all of the negotiations. So that's a little bit of that policy context for biodiversity. And we really have reached a stage of maturity, I think, in that we've had 2 major UN reports, quite different in their character in the last 3 years. So the biodiversity equivalent of IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And there are now 135 members, countries are members of that platform. That produced what is perhaps a landmark report. The platform was only established in 2012. So 7 years later, it produced its global assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And it did many, many things, but two of them have attracted quite a lot of attention and have had major impact on subsequent policy. One of them was really boiling down the evidence into what's threatening biodiversity to 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss. And they are the change to land and sea use, overexploitation, invasive species, pollution, and climate change. So those are termed the 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss. And it's not difficult to begin to think about ways that those are represented in the blue economy, those 5 main drivers. And certainly in significant parts of the world, the major headline finding that came out of that report was that up to 1 million species are facing extinction. And that did attract a lot of global attention. And then the following year, the Convention on Biological Diversity produced its scorecard, its report, its end-of-term report on its 2011 to 2020, so a decade-long strategic plan for biodiversity, produced that in Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, really showing not a very good picture. They'd agreed 20 targets in 5 strategic goal areas in 2010 that they would start pursuing from 2011. One around underlying drivers, one around immediate goal around underlying drivers, one goal around immediate pressures, a goal for what they wanted to see for the status of biodiversity, a goal for thinking, how do we want to see the benefits of a rich biodiverse world shared amongst people, and a 5th goal around how do we implement this ambitious strategic plan. 20 different targets, and 6 of them had very little progress, a few were partially achieved, but none of those 20 targets were completely achieved. So that gives us the message that the natural world is under threat, and we really are not doing, we're not achieving what we are setting out to achieve. So IPBES's global assessment report had a few key messages. So one of those was nature and its vital contributions to people, which together embody biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, are deteriorating worldwide. The direct and indirect drivers of change have accelerated during the past 50 years. Halfway through CBD's last strategic plan, the midterm review said that although efforts to conserve biodiversity had increased, the pressures had increased at a much greater rate. So biodiversity was still deteriorating. So it's all well and good increasing our efforts, but unless we tackle these direct and indirect drivers, we are not going to, we're continually going to see more and more biodiversity, if you like, putting in the accident and emergency room, rather than trying to drive and tackle these underlying symptoms. The third key message is the goals for conserving and sustainably using nature and achieving sustainability cannot be met by current trajectories, and goals for 2030 and beyond may only be achieved through transformative changes across economic, political, social, and technological factors. So we really need to change fundamentally the way that we trade, the way that we value, and the way that we use our natural world. And fourth, nature can be conserved, restored, and used sustainably, while other global societal goals are simultaneously met through urgent and concrete concerted efforts, fostering transformative change. So it is possible. IPBES has done a lot of work on scenario modeling that brings together the trade, use, as well as what we know about the ecology and status of our natural world. And a few lessons that the CBD have learned in Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 from implementing the strategic plan for biodiversity. And these reflect that some of these points have already been brought up in some of the welcome notes, as well as in the findings that IPBES found. Greater efforts to address direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity, For example, much more integrated and holistic approaches to planning and implementation, and greater interaction among government, ministries, economic sectors, and society generally is badly needed. We've got to do that better than we have done so far. We need to strengthen integration of what perhaps have been thought of in the past, certainly in some sectors, as non-traditional. CBD is certainly keen to open up its work to, as it calls, non-party stakeholders, non-state actors. So we've got to strengthen integration of gender, the role of Indigenous people and local communities, broadening the way that we make decisions and engage people. We've got to have much better designed goals and targets with clear and simple language, and where possible, quantitative elements. So we need to figure out how much biodiversity, whether it is targets for extent of habitats or ecosystem function or numbers of individuals in species. Those are the kind of goals that we need to have. We do need to have increased ambition for our national commitments and much better reviewing of our national activities than we have done so far. We've got to learn and manage and adaptively manage better than we have done. Again, that is, many of these things come down to working and cooperating across sectoral boundaries. And we do need to take a little bit of time to understand reasons why some policy measures are effective and others are ineffective. And all of this does require a much greater attention to implementation. From a species point of view, I'm certainly very conscious that after 2010, many species conservationists were delighted to get a very, very strong target in the CBD strategic plan. But after that, for 5 years, there's hardly any engagement with all of those parties and the CBD Secretariat who had the task of trying to implement. How do we conserve species? So we need to pay attention. We need to work together to have much more sustained implementation. So we are now in the last few months of developing this post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We are in 2022 because of a couple of years delay caused by COVID and the challenges of trying to move negotiations forward when you are meeting by Zoom. So this is CBD's Convention on Biological Diversity, and I think, again, it wraps around and embodies everything that the blue economy wishes to achieve. Living in harmony, where by 2050 biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. So what we're looking at now, what the parties to CBD, and the CBD has been signed by all UN member states apart from the US and the Vatican. So it is a truly global convention. But they're looking to much more explicitly identify the biodiversity outcomes that we want to see and what do we need to do in order to achieve those outcomes. And those targets there really boil down into addressing those IPBES 5 drivers. So the first 3 of those targets are all concerned with managing our sea and our terrestrial landscapes. How do we do that better than we have done? The fourth one I'll come and talk about in a moment. But then fourth, harvesting sustainably, is around avoiding overexploitation. Invasive species is tackling invasive species, tackling pollution, and tackling climate change. So those are the other 4 main drivers. So at the moment, before the last negotiating meeting in Nairobi in June, the wording of this goal that we want to see has got 3, I've put in bold there, if you can see them, 3 particular words. So it's something there concerned with making sure we have integral natural ecosystems. We've got healthy, robust, and unthreatened species. And we are also looking after our genetic diversity. And those are the 3 levels of biodiversity, if you like, that are defined in the CBD's definition of biodiversity. Highlighted there now on the right-hand side is intensive management, which is a quite different kind of target, because a little bit of work that we've done here at Newcastle with IUCN and other partners has shown that even if we tackle those, if there's 5 drivers of biodiversity loss, there is still 57% of species that are on the IUCN red list that will not have all of their threats removed. So we do need targeted action for 57% of threatened species. And on average, that's 54 species per country. And just looking there in that second bullet point, the kind of things we're thinking about, you can already begin to imagine that targeted action for individual species becomes very resource intensive. So the more species that we can keep out of this sort of emergency room by tackling some of those underlying drivers, it'll be far more sustainable for economies, for people that have got the responsibilities of trying to avoid species extinctions. And we'll all be able to benefit from those species and natural resources much more. So tackling the underlying pressures, again, I'm not going to talk here about intensive management, but because that's quite a different action target, but looking at those other 5 drivers. So again, working with IUCN and a whole host of others, because there has been no way previously of thinking, if we want to see the best outcome for species, so you can think of many marine species, whether it is coastal plant species or some of our magnificent big mega charismatic species in the deep oceans. If we want to conserve those species and keep them there so that we can benefit from them as a society, whether it's locally, nationally or globally, how do we identify the particular threats so that we could look, maybe take a national approach and identify collectively for us as a country, what are the pressures that are driving our species closest to extinction. So in order to have to come up with something that is robust, we need to have data on how threatened a species is. We need to have a sense of the threats that are causing the species decline, and we need to know where that species occurs, what the extent is of its habitat. So we've developed this using a metric called species threat abatement and restoration to meet this need. And just to give a sense of how global that is, we're 85 authors from a whole host of institutions, not just academics. So we have got a sense that from government that there is strong policy potential, because in order to try and achieve a species outcome, which is in the Convention on Biological Diversity, it ties it very closely to immediate policy needs, such as tackling invasive species, issues around land and sea management. And we're rolling this out much more with business and finance sectors at the moment as well. So just to give you a sense of what that means in practice, the global picture here shows the darker the lines, the darker the shading there on the left-hand side, are the areas where we've got the highest risk of extinction. So that's a combination of numbers of species, whether it's a little bit threatened. So on the IUCN red list, it might be considered vulnerable, and whether it's only part of a species range in that area. At the other extreme, we've got highly threatened species, many species, and all of the range might be in a particular country. So we can see where those fall out, those global hotspots, if you like, fall out on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we can see there in that bar chart the threats that are having the biggest impact globally. So we can see, not surprisingly perhaps, that it is the way that we're changing our landscape that is having the biggest impact on threatened species. And if we are able to restore habitat, we do know that there is quite a lot of extent of where species have occurred relatively recently that could recolonize those areas if we restored those habitats. So have a little bit of a look now at 3 Caribbean islands, just to get a sense that There are some really interesting differences. There are general global patterns, yes, sure, but there are also some very interesting differences. One of the advantages that we think our metric has is that it can be looked at whatever spatial scale you want to look at. We've even looked at it down at a landscape scale. You could look at it at protected area scale. So there's quite a lot of spatial flexibility that you can have. But here we could see that Trinidad looks quite different from Barbados and Jamaica in that the biggest threat. So if from a policy point of view, your policy objective was to make sure that species did not risk extinction, you'd want to tackle invasive and other problematic species. Whereas for Barbados and Jamaica, you're looking at the annual and perennial non-timber cropping. So you can see that there are some quite interesting differences, and Barbados really stands out that habitat restoration would make a huge difference in getting species off that IUCN threatened species list. So some really interesting differences there, some similarities, but also some differences. And then if we look at the OECS member states there with the figure on the left-hand side, interestingly, invasive and other problematic species comes out as the biggest issue that you would want to tackle if you wanted to reduce your overall risk of species extinctions. Climate change and severe weather also much more evident when those red list assessments are being made than it has been in other parts of the world. So very interesting differences and similarities there that we can draw. So what does that mean? Well, we've got this information. It does mean that governments, investors, businesses, NGOs and communities can actually begin to look and to consider exactly how they can not only not add threats to species and therefore biodiversity, but also look and consider how they can implement actions that could improve the status. So there are examples up here. So philanthropic investment could eliminate invasive species. Perhaps in some places, indigenous peoples could reduce unsustainable logging. Private finance could transform commercial agriculture. Government could expand and effectively manage national park or other protected areas that are managed in other ways. So there's many different ways that this information can be used. One really sort of hot off the press, interesting development is that we've now got, we're in the position where we've got able to define the area of habitat for marine species in a way that we were not when we developed that initial piece of work. So maybe one thing to think about and to mull over is the extent to which and the potential for adapting this approach to a large ocean state. We've got a new PhD student here at Newcastle who will be looking at trying to apply STAR in the marine realm. So if there are people who are keen to try and look at the blue economy in the Caribbean or elsewhere, then please get in touch and we can see whether there might be some opportunities to have discussions about that. So in the last couple of slides, I just want to go away from the immediate spatial aspects to show that I've shown what the challenges are for Barbados, Jamaica and Trinidad. But those problems are, many of those problems are born elsewhere. And we increasingly understand how threats to species can be exported from countries that are great consumers. So very happy to, here in the UK, lots of coffee all around Europe, but we don't grow coffee. So where does that coffee come from? What impact does our demand for coffee have elsewhere? And in many blue economy countries, it's thinking the reverse. Where are the drivers for the challenges that we have in managing our natural resources? Where do they come from? And we're bringing together some of these life cycle analyses with the spatial approach that we've been able to develop does offer us quite significant promise for being able to really pinpoint flows of threats from where the demand is all the way through to where those threats have a very real impact on the ground across international borders. So you can see here some of the, from a decade-old publication from a group in Australia that show just how interrelated our threats to biodiversity are from resource consumption. And just to finish off the last piece of sort of information before summarizing is that IPBES is also really trying to identify these linkages, telecoupling as they call it, these threats across borders, and showing who are the biggest exporters of threats and who are the biggest importers of threats. So we can see this on a global scale, but we're increasingly able to refine that so that small island developing states, large ocean states would be able to have a look at these flows of trade to see where are those trades, where are the origins, and what is the impact on biodiversity as they move through that trade chain. We are also beginning to have conversations with finance and finance organizations and companies to see if there is or if there are ways also of monitoring and identifying how finance flows through these commercial trade routes as well. So still some work to go, but the pieces are beginning to fall into place. So just to finish, there is a very supportive and increasingly integrated global policy landscape. The ongoing negotiations for the Global Biodiversity Framework are seeking to link actions to outcomes. And I've only put up there the targets that relate immediately to biodiversity, but there are many targets relating to resource mobilization and effective and equitable benefit sharing and for the benefit access to the benefits of biodiversity, so that not all of the benefits go to countries that have, at the moment, have more resource, have more finance. So those benefits are shared equally. There are promising research developments that are enhancing our understanding of interactions that are impacting biodiversity. And it really would be wonderful to get a sense of how strong these are in the blue economy negotiations and discussions as they emerge. And these developments are increasingly informing policy and management decisions so that they can improve biodiversity outcomes at a range of scales. And finally, hopefully all of this will help identify the policies that we need to ensure, that are needed to ensure a robust environment and ensure that we are living in harmony with nature by 2050 as envisaged by the Convention on Biological Diversity. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Phil. Can you hear me? Can you hear
Yes,
me?
I can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that comprehensive opening presentation, looking really through the prism of a biodiversity framework at what are some of the threats and ultimately what are some of the prospects for better management of the biodiverse space to ensure that we can mitigate some of the adverse effects possibly of some of these challenges that you identified. I was really interested in sort of the last couple of slides where you're looking to trace how much of that biodiversity problem is imported into the region in particular. So a lot of that kind of work, and especially the PhD work of your student, would be very interesting from our perspectives to see what is the link between these imports from other countries and what impacts they're having on small island developing states. So thank you so much for that presentation. I know we kept you talking for quite a while. We're really happy to welcome you and have you here. And we probably will have some point later on today or tomorrow to allow persons to introduce themselves. But before any further ado, I'd like to thank Professor and ask him if he's able to stick around for the second presentation by our second professor today. We have from the University of the West Indies, we have Professor Judith Gobin, who is head of the Department of Life Sciences in the Faculty of Science and Technology at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. She is a marine biologist with more than 38 years of research experience in the field and has made significant academic contributions in the field of marine biodiversity in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. She has published in a number of new marine scientific records and new marine species, approximately 300 for Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, as she began her research career working in shallow, soft sediment, benthic environments, and then moved to rocky shore areas, and more recently into the deep sea environments. So from what I understand, Professor is going to now take more of a sort of a deep dive into some of the challenges, opportunities, maybe more the scientific challenges from the perspective of Caribbean countries. So really, I think Professor McGowan gave us a great sort of broad view, and now we're going to sort of deep dive, no pun intended, into the Caribbean and some of the issues that we face from a scientific perspective when thinking about the blue economy. So Professor, I understand you also have a PowerPoint, so I'll invite you just to share your
Yes,
screen.
thank you so very much, Jan. And let me just share this, and I just want you to give me the okay that you're seeing it, please. I'll go to the...
Yes, we're seeing it now. You may want to... Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, and you're hearing me okay?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much to the organizers for this opportunity to discuss what is really a very, very important topic. And of course, as Jan has mentioned, Prof. McGowan set the global scene in terms of biodiversity. And I am definitely, as a marine biologist, I'm going to take you into the ocean now, where we're talking now management of the blue economy. And of course, I'm talking from a scientific perspective, which is of course very key and very relevant to the conversation, and especially in terms of trade. Most of us are probably already aware what the key sectors are in terms of the blue growth and blue economy that are being targeted. Now, in terms of the Caribbean and many small island developing states, this is not new. Blue growth is really not new. We have been living and thriving off of our island economies. And of course, which these tend to be focused on, of course, fisheries, transportation, tourism, and so on. So the key sectors that have been identified to a large extent, now that blue growth and the blue economy is in the conversation, of course, it's expanded, it's extended. So we're talking renewables, we're talking key port infrastructure services, we're talking increased coastal development, we're talking and having to think about carbon sequestration. The conversation on climate change, of course, is very, very relevant. And we need to now think about all of these activities. They were always there before, but what are the new economies? What are the new activities that we're going into? And of course, key to all of this is coastal protection, and whether it's restoration, whether it's mitigation. So just highlighting those. Now, there was a conference in 2018 in Kenya, and I'm using the slides where it's really just bringing it to the table, creating economic growth that is inclusive and sustainable. It really is all inclusive. And I thought it would be a good idea to highlight the different sort of facets. So people, culture, communities and societies, employment, job creation, poverty eradication, sustainable energy, mineral resources, innovative industries. At the same time, It's climate action. It's how do we manage agricultural waste? How do we keep our oceans free from pollution? How do we manage and sustain marine life as we know it? How do we consider to balance the activities, development activities, with at the same time conservation and economic? Of course, there are economic activities that we need to balance with countries and their economies. But how do we keep these sustainable? Smart shipping, smart transportation, smart global connectivity. At the same time, building safe and resilient communities. And this was actually what the focus of the conference in Kenya was in 2018. When we engage in the blue economy, we also want to consider securing food supplies. We want to consider ending hunger. We want to consider promoting good health and to continue to improve on the quality of life for people, and of course, especially island people. And at the same time, cities, tourism, we want these to be resilient, coasts and infrastructure. And we need to consider maritime security, safety, and regulatory enforcement, which is, of course, very key to the trade conversation. Indeed, it's a very tall order for us as SIDS territories to have this all-encompassing, very, very key objectives, but how do we balance it? How can we really manage it all? In the Caribbean and in other small island developing territories and SIDS territories, it's a unique development space. One of the key things that scientists continue to address when we are in conversation about the blue economy, we really don't want it to just be seen as the ocean is open for business. Because this can be very detrimental. It can actually affect the very nature of the overall objectives of engaging in the blue economy and reaping the benefits of the blue economy. At the same time, as I mentioned, this is not new to island territories, using the ocean, living and breathing off of the ocean. Of course, there are conflicting uses and activities, and in the bits highlighted in the earlier slides, of course, where you have in coastal environments especially, it is limited. We already have conflicting uses and activities going on. You may have a port very close to a very nice beach, or you may have a hotel that's very close to a fishing center and fishing facilities for island people. This is already facing us even before the notion, the global notion that let's engage in the global blue economy. What does this sector mean to us? The Caribbean is designated or has been recognized as a very important hotspot for biodiversity. It's recognized being around number 5. And the World Bank has valued the blue economy associated with the Caribbean at about 407 billion. As I mentioned, I think as islands, we already know this. A lot of it has been coming to us. A lot of the economies are based on really blue blue activities. As I mentioned, fishing, Trinidad and Tobago, of course, is an oil and gas based economy. Yachting, we have a huge marine, we have a number of marinas in Trinidad and Tobago. We've all engaged in tourism in the Caribbean. So that really has been the constituents of the blue economy as we know it. But with the new sort of engagement where we have to balance and really look carefully at the various sectors that have been identified in the blue economy and which many of us as territories have adopted, there will be the need for marine spatial planning, as we call it. There will need to be relocations from the defined space that's For example, we find with the incompatibility, as I've mentioned before, we may now have to move activities. We may have to request that a port needs to move, because we are now looking at the defined space and we are recognizing what's the best value for money, basically, at the same time that we can achieve all the various objectives, good quality of life, good conditions for people, growth in the economy, and so on. So compatibility becomes very key. At the same time, for us to look at the same time, in a lot of small island territories, and including the Caribbean, there is fragmented ocean governance. That means there are the different institutions and organizations that are responsible for a particular activity or particular type of engagement, particular type of development. There's incompatibility in that in itself, so that you may have, of course, the fisheries division, the fisheries ministry is separate from, let's say, the waste disposal and from the maritime ministry. So the governance is not as smooth as it should be. And by extension, that means even at a regional level, and now that speaks to the national development itself, that also is not very cohesive. So as a region, CARICOM SIDS, that's one of the challenges that we will face in moving forward with the blue growth. Just again, quickly highlighting, with each of these activities, the development types of activities, whether it's new and a new activity like the development of an aquaculture industry, all of these developmental activities already have impacts that we are very aware of. We know it's damaging to our coral reefs. We know water quality has been degraded. We know we have reduced fisheries, and in terms of catches and the value, the economic value. We know there's coastal destruction. We know there's continued watershed degradation. And of course, all of this is compounded by the global climate change impacts. So global climate change is really compounding a lot of the negatives, the depletion, the destruction, the reduced water quality, the climate change activities itself, where we have increased hurricanes, increased drought, increased rains, and a combination of these really then further compound what we already have as negative impacts, even that we create locally and regionally. So biodiversity loss, of course, is associated with the overall ecosystem degradation that we need to be considering. Just a quick intervention here. So in 2013 and 14, the EV Nautilus, which was an exploration vessel with Professor Robert Ballard, came to the Caribbean, and I was fortunate to get on board. And some of these photos are actually what's in our deep sea waters. For the first time, we're talking 3,000 to 4,000 meters depth. And this is what we were able to see. And I've documented it in scientific papers, as well as there's a very nice video. So deep sea biodiversity, which is one of the components of the blue economy, and we're talking biodiversity, we're talking how can we use, and I think there were a couple of questions earlier, what really is the value of this biodiversity? And how do we incorporate it into the blue growth and the blue economy? Well, first of all, it's very much still unknown, the deep sea biodiversity in the Caribbean and in other small island territories, because there are few deep sea scientists. There's a lack of scientific opportunities. As I mentioned, I happened to be engaged by the research vessel that was coming to the Caribbean, and I was very fortunate. And I'm pleased to say that since then, I've really just ventured into the deep sea environment and the research to really to show where we can go with really improving the knowledge of our deep sea biodiversity. We've been doing a lot of research in coastal areas and in inshore areas. The marine environments of the Caribbean are fairly well known and fairly well documented, but we don't know much about our deep sea environment and the biodiversity. There's a lack of funding, and of course, there's a lack of sophisticated high technology equipment, because really, when you're doing a coastal, let's say, sampling inventory in marine areas of the Caribbean and other small island territories, you can do that with inexpensive gear. But if we're going deep sea environment, we're talking high-tech equipment and the need for resources, financial resources. So we've had a limited access to the data. Phil talked to us about the CBD related to the deep sea environment, and a knowledge of the deep sea biodiversity is the BBNJ Treaty, or the Treaty of the High Seas, which is an international agreement on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. So we're talking beyond national jurisdiction. As I mentioned, we have a pretty good idea of what's in our EEZ, relatively more sort of inshore and coastal areas. We don't really know a lot of, that extent when we extend further into our EEZ. But when we're now going out into areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is where a lot of the activities on the high seas will continue to take place. So the treaty is currently under negotiation, and I've been involved in it at the United Nations. We're talking as small island developing states, as CARICOM scientists and SIDS territories, as well as the Pacific SIDS. We've joined under the Association of Small Island Developing States, and we have been contributing on the key elements of the package, which are all very relevant to what we're talking about. So the key elements are access and benefit sharing of the resources that are in the deep sea, and by extension, areas beyond national jurisdiction. Marine genetic resources, and I'll talk a little bit more about these, EIAs and strategic environmental assessments. And as I mentioned in the earlier slide, we have been talking about how do we improve on the funding, how do we improve on capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, bearing in mind that we have limited marine scientists on the whole. And of course, when we're moving into territories like this, we're talking, this is now high-tech equipment, the need for these opportunities to go out. So the challenge for small island territories, and including Caribbean and the Pacific SIDS, in the areas beyond national jurisdiction is the same really for when we're trying to venture out into our own deep sea territories. So the unknown deep sea territories and biodiversity is exactly the same as the unknown deep sea biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Few scientists, access to data, scientific opportunities, but I again highlight the photos here, and just to say that, so we uncovered, and this is where we recognized about 178 species that are new to science for the Caribbean when we engaged in this deep sea activities with the EV Nautilus, as I mentioned earlier. Now, a lot of these, they're new to science, and the value of the biodiversity is therefore still unknown. What do we need when we talk about capacity building? We're talking about development of research clusters. And here we're talking coastal, understanding the marine environment, as well as the deep sea environment. We need to have more scientific research, training opportunities, we need to have more career opportunities for scientists, for researchers, so that we can begin to cross over where the science is really guiding the policy and the public policies, and especially when we're talking blue growth and the blue economy. I've mentioned already about the training workshops, developing the expertise and recognizing again the need for this CARICOM governance. In other words, the challenges are similar for CARICOM islands, territories, and therefore we need to be working together because, let's face it, in the oceans, as we're talking, there is this interconnectivity that is key to ocean territories and ocean development activities. So what happens further north, what happens in Jamaica and Cuba will impact what's happening much further south, as an example in Trinidad and Tobago. So the governance team and the conversation needs, and that's in reference to development of the blue economy, it needs to be considering or give due consideration to the transboundary issues. I did mention marine genetic resources, and it's very key to the blue economy and the conversation of not just the deep sea environments and the unknown, but even within our exclusive economic zones. The value of this unknown biodiversity is can be very rewarding, because for a long time now, you would have probably read, or you're probably aware, that a lot of drugs, a lot of cosmetic products, and these are like cancer drugs and so on, pharmaceuticals, have come from, for example, Caribbean sponges, Caribbean corals. The extracts are they've been collected from organisms in the Caribbean and other small islands, and they've been replicated in the laboratories. And this is where the biotechnology comes in. And of course, these are what we term the marine genetic resources, so that these are novel species that we're talking about. We're talking about new biomaterials, new industrial bioprocesses. In other words, there's an array of compounds that can be manufactured in the labs when you're actually using the genetic material of these resources. So there is a great potential. There is a great need for understanding and appreciating our biodiversity. And that hence I keep stressing on the unknown and why it is then important that for us as scientists, and it's important for the territories to understand what we have before it is actually degraded, before it is destroyed. So there is that need for us to build capacity, engage in training, have more, train more deep sea, more marine scientists, including deep sea scientists. And of course, we are all very familiar in general environmental management, that there is the EIA process, or the environmental impact assessment process. That has been around with us for quite some time. The strategies to minimize and mitigate against the environmental impacts. But we need to now think with some of these other activities that we're talking about, what are introducing within the blue economy, the blue sector, what would we consider as the conditions of operations? What do we want to, when we're balancing where these are located, we're thinking the marine spatial, the spatial strategy, what can we put close to on the shoreline, what needs to be moved, what needs to not sort of be conflicting. The EIA process needs to be reviewed. So no longer will it just be what we've been doing for activities that we were accustomed to doing before. We need to now really look deeper at the kind of management system, and really we need to move towards what we call a strategic environmental assessment, where we consider a range of analytical participation, that's engagement of communities, that's consideration for the policies and plans already in place. So here we have, this is your basic sort of environmental impact assessment process, which was really more specific to a particular type of activity. But when we move towards more the strategic environmental impact assessment, we are considering the proposed activities, let's say, in a particular area where we have looked at carefully, we've considered these are the types of activities that we are going to be investing in, and therefore we need to look at it more at a strategic level, and that's really the difference. In other words, it's not going to be totally specific to just the one activity or one development activity. So what is needed is we need to consider with all the different sectors and engagements, as I mentioned, the integration of the strategic environmental assessment into the planning and management process. It's now multi-sector. It's now thinking about the environmental and the socioeconomic impacts. We need to be working closer with the regulatory bodies and authorities towards achieving this. What's not very easy, it's not very easy given the numbers of goals that we want to achieve, but as small island territories, as CARICOM SIDS, we must engage in it, because we don't want to be at the stage where we've already had these negative impacts. We've already have destruction of the environment. We're starting really this movement into the blue sector, or movement again into the blue sector, because as I mentioned, it really isn't new to islands, but we are moving and forging ahead with all of these new activities. Maybe we need to really take a step back and work out how we are going to invest in monitoring, how we're going to invest in assessments at a national and a regional level, how we're going to look carefully at, and where is the financing going to come from for monitoring, environmental monitoring, as we proceed to engage in the different development sectors. So in small island territories, really, we need to consider, and of course, it's managing activities within the exclusive economic zone. In the Caribbean, we're the most geographically and politically diverse and complex region for various reasons in the world. We are culturally diverse, and we still have from very poor to the most wealthy in terms of development. We do have substantial challenges, and as a marine scientist, I keep, there is that need to increase the funding, the capacity building, setting us up, getting us to a stage where we can actually deal with some of these challenges that we are being faced with, and especially as we will be moving further into development of the blue sector. When we first started, on the absolute left of your screen, we started where researchers from a variety of disciplines worked together, having different specific projects, separate questions. We've come a long way to interdisciplinary research, where we're interacting with different goals, allowing different components to feed into our ability to answer the different questions. But really where we want to go is that exchanging of information, to where we move to the specific approaches, sharing resources and integrating the disciplines. I think really what I'm trying to say with this slide is that we really need to move to integration. And that means even at a national level, at a scientific level, at a sort of governance level, and to a large extent in respect of at the global level. I think one of the key things that has been mentioned is that we are hearing the sort of blue sector moving into the blue economy. It's a term being bandied by global peoples, and we in the Caribbean, but I want to say that we in the Caribbean and CARICOM territories, other SIDS territories, we need to appreciate what these developments, these new projects mean to small islands like ourselves, and how can we work with it? It may not be that what is being proposed to us is doable or is Caribbean centered, and it may not achieve the goals that we would like for ourselves. Already in terms of protection of the marine habitats, we have some implementation of protection within EIA, the EIA structures for the specific species, as was alluded to by Prof. McGowan earlier. We are putting things in place for reducing degradation, for protection. So we have been doing our bits, but as I mentioned, with the new development sectors that we may be considering going into, we really need to think carefully about how we are going to protect these resources. And I think there was a question earlier about the importance of biodiversity, and it relates to climate change. So the resilience, for example, of a coral reef, and the resilience of the biodiversity is what enriches that and allows for the resilience of a coral reef. So when you have loss of reef species and you have loss of biodiversity in these areas, then the resilience of the reef is reduced. That means the sort of giving nature of the actual ecosystem is diminished. And then, of course, there are the associated changes. When you degrade the reef, then you remove the protective function. And of course, then that's where that relationship with climate change comes in, because you've now removed a key ecosystem function of protection of a coastal area. So the biodiversity is very, very keenly related to the protection and related to climate change actions. I've put this in here because if we wanted to do all to achieve all of the objectives, I consider it to be a very tall order. When we look at the different activities that we, as I mentioned, in small islands already engage in, and how do we do all of these things? This is really what we're trying to say the complete picture should be when we engage in blue economy activities in a sustainable way. It's a lot, it's a very tall order, and I really think that for Caribbean territories and small island territories, it's a huge balancing act. And as a scientist, I urge Caribbean territories as well as other small island territories to balance carefully the activities, the blue economy activities that they choose as a nation to engage in. And I'm going to stop there, Jan, I think, and then I have another short presentation on the Grenada case study. So, but I'll just leave that to you for a moment.
Thank you so much, Prof. Just wondering maybe if you stop sharing your screen.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, it's a tall order, as you say, and a lot of the ideas or the thoughts I had as you were presenting was, who is doing all of this sort of quantifiable data analysis and collection across the region? I mean, besides your entity in St. Augustine, is there and I know I'm preempting other questions, but is there a major sort of research center that's kind of collecting that data at all, or is it really your institution and you basically doing a lot of that work? I'm just curious about that.
Well, as you would be aware of, you know, the University of West Indies, we all have, and the academics, we have a huge, in Mona, Jamaica, there's the Marine Center. We also have, at the different campus levels, we have marine scientists engaging in a lot of this work. And of course, we work with other, you know, developed country territories and institutions, as we are with Newcastle and so on. So these relationships we're developing, we're trying to broaden the activities that we engage in, but at the moment we don't have a centralized unit that's really working on the blue economy sectors, I guess. Having said that, as you know, the 5 campus, the Five Islands, sorry, we've got the new Center for Oceanography and Blue Economy. So I'm hoping that that's going to be the sort of central sort of hub for all of the activities that we at the university engage in.
Yes, indeed. We had sent out an invitation to persons in that center, but we haven't yet heard anything. But if we do by the end of the week, it would be great to have them featured on this course as well. But great overview, and thank you for doing all that important work for the region. Okay, please, Professor, go ahead and do your second presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so hearing me okay, John?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, so I just thought, based on, you know, the whole conversation, that it's a good idea if we look at a case study, and we have a very good example of a case. Well, we have a very good example of the adoption of the Blue Economy strategy from Grenada. Okay, so I've done this before with the relocations, considerations, and so on. So Grenada got at the Global Ocean Summit, and this is just a little background for Blue Growth and Security, that took place in 2014. Grenada got fully on board and began to develop the blue economy as a pillar of the country's future growth. They produced a global network for action on blue growth and food, which was launched in Grenada in 2015. And then they also hosted a Blue Grenada program and Blue Week investment, and very positively went all the way forward, involving some other key partnerships and for looking at sustainable aquaculture systems, fisheries, and so on. And of course, Grenada now also has a Blue Innovation Institute. So the potential opportunities are obviously great for Grenada, that has an exclusive economic zone of about 26,000, which is square kilometers, which is 75 times larger than the country's land area. Again, we hear of this more appropriate description of our islands as being large ocean states, which is exactly what we are. And of course, Grenada is a very key example. Grenada, for background, is one of 3 main islands, which includes Carriacou and Petit Martinique, and there are 27 smaller islands and islets. At the 2014 conference, it was seen as a timely and much needed opportunity for countries to look together at how both the private and public sector can help finance initiatives and projects in various blue economy sectors. So it really is, it comes to the fore that these engagement and the different types of activities, we really, it must be an integration of the private sector and the public sector contribution so that it can actually be successful. It was the perfect timing for Grenada, having struggled after Hurricane Ivan really was impacted quite negatively the island's economy. And Grenada has been really positive in turning in a green direction. We know the green economy, we're talking the blue economy today, and we also know there's a brown agenda in terms of the actual physical planning activities. Grenada has committed to do its part by reducing its greenhouse emissions by 30%, which is quite a remarkable commitment. 30% by 2025, and is already moving towards 100% renewable energy by 2030. And it's been actively engaging in geothermal energy type sources and wind and solar resources. The objectives as identified by the blue economy sector in Grenada is to optimize the coastal, marine, and ocean resources to become a world leader and an international prototype for creating blue growth and sustainability. And to a large extent, that has been quite really an achievement for such a small island territory, and of course, in terms of its future prosperity. Grenada is the first in the OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, to have developed such a detailed vision for blue growth. And coming out of the 2014 details, comprehensive set of blue projects and policies, and again, with the key goal and objective. They also set up a National Ocean Governance Committee, and to engage and look at the specific activities of setting up marine protected areas by 2020. And that is to conserve a large part of the nearshore marine area that with key ecosystems. And they also put together a Blue Growth Coastal Master Plan. And that came out of a number of stakeholder workshops and so on. And this is taken straight out of they've got a lovely, Grenada has a lovely blue economy text, a book. And these were the blue growth centers. So as you could see, Petit Martinique, you could see marine services, shipping and industry, all the things that we've spoken about, global tourism, huge encouragement for science and technology, ecotourism, at the same time managing its marine research and reserve and marine protected areas. And so these were the key, there were 9 or 10 key development incentives, and of course with fairly well detailed in terms of the growth. And of course from a marine ecosystem perspective, there was details about coral restoration, mangrove rehabilitation, and a lot of the programs that they identified were community-based programs. And as we heard earlier, what we're looking at is nature-based solutions for protection, conservation, rehabilitation, and to some extent mitigation. So these are active programs that they put in place for and engaging with global scientists, engaging with other institutions, with a number of external institutions to work with the communities and the local scientists towards the development of those kinds of protective measures. They also worked together on developing the fishing industry, and especially at the village of Guave. And they continued to look carefully at each of the projects that were identified and vetting them, of course, for the environmental implications and whether it fitted into the plan's larger vision. And again, as I mentioned, in terms of compatibility and the actual physical space. So there was consideration about the actual designated space that a particular activity would be located in and or considered for location or for perhaps even shifting. Grenada already has a commercial fishery that's dominated by large pelagic species. And so in the consideration, as you would expect, for when one wants to develop the seafood export market even more than it is or greater, it means that you have to consider protection of the nursery areas for these for this commercial fishery. And therefore, you need to be balancing the other investment sectors with, at the same time, protecting these particular ecosystems. So, as I mentioned in the earlier talk, there's a lot of balancing that needs to be done. And of course, as we spoke about climate change, given all of these potential, given all of these prospective activities, we need to, what was considered was having these insurance programs against climate change risks and so on. Ocean, I mentioned in the earlier talk about the Ocean Governance Institute and the scientific research that Grenada has been encouraging. And the picture on the left of your screen there shows out of the research that we had done on the exploration vessel in 2014 that I mentioned in the last presentation. We actually did some work at Kikamjeni. And when I say work, so it means we're looking at the videography for what's living in Kikamjeni at the depths of 2,000–3,000 meters and so on. And it was a very exciting, as you can imagine, adventure. It was an exciting research experience with Kikamjeni in Grenada being the only active submarine volcano in the Caribbean. And there is great potential for scientific discovery. And in fact, the picture on the left shows the largest mussel, Bathymodiolus species that we retrieved from the Kikamjeni environs. It is the largest one on record to date. So there is, I mentioned about the new discoveries, new things. These mussels, they live on organic material. Of course, there's no there's no light, there's no sort of primary production at this level, but yet we have organisms that are living and thriving. So there is the whole need for developing scientific research, and Grenada has identified this and identified looking at developing the prospects in terms of marine biotechnology and marine genetic resources, as I mentioned, at the same time protecting the environment. They've also proposed the aquaculture investment to produce 60 million tons of sustainable aquaculture by 2030. And they joined with the Dominican and Marshall Islands to promote a new initiative to educate across the world about ocean sustainability and make it part of every school's curriculum by 2030. And really, this is ocean governance, ocean communications, which we really, I applaud it, because we really, a lot of our Caribbean territories and a lot of our school children in Caribbean territories don't know enough about the marine environment. So having this We Are Oceans project and promotion was really very quite interesting and a step in the right direction. Continuing the research, continuing the science, continuing development, and engaging local communities, including children. But I want to go to one of the issues that that is identified in the sector for growth. And as a Caribbean scientist, as a global scientist, I say no. I join with my other science colleagues and we say no to deep sea mining. Now, deep sea mining, the mineral resources in the deep sea, it's really like the last frontier, because we have engaged a lot in terrestrial activities. The mineral resources, it's very rich in resources, all of the sort of gold and copper and so on that you're having in your cell phones and in your computers. This is where it comes from, the deep sea minerals resources. But deep sea mining, I mentioned earlier about the unimagined, undiscovered yet biodiversity. Picture a bulldozer, picture a dredger, just dredging up the deep sea 3,000 to 4,000 meters for these minerals, locating them and bringing them back up to the surface. It's wanton destruction, which as a marine scientist, and I belong to a group of deep ocean stewardship scientists, DOSI initiative. We don't know enough about this deep sea biodiversity. We don't know enough about these treasures that we have. We do not want to destroy them before we even get to know what's there. Bear in mind that communities that you see on the screen, some of the sponges, some of the corals, not in this particular slide, but they take millions of years to grow. So by us destroying them, even before we understand totally the value, deep sea scientists were not in favor of deep sea mining, which is mentioned as a blue growth activity in a lot of other islands, territories, but specifically it's also mentioned in the Grenada Blue Growth Initiative. As I mentioned earlier, yes, we're very happy about the green policy and the differences in protecting the areas. And this is totally acceptable, totally on board with the balancing, the conservation, the sustainability of the different activities that were identified in the blue economy sector. They engaged in a Blue Week 2016, and I've got it. Grenada, the picture really is not a very good one, but of course Grenada boasts of an offshore medical school, which is very lucrative for Grenada, and of course with the islands, the different activities, of course it will continue to develop the blue sectors. Combined with all the other activities, the yachting, the dive tourism, blue marina services, and so on, now, as I mentioned, the coastal medical, the ocean energy, seabed operations, which, as I mentioned, not in favor of. I've got those in red, not in favor of. And again, just coming back to the interconnectivity of territories, we really, as small islands, and that's CARICOM SIDS as well as Pacific SIDS, we've been talking at a global level at the very BBNJ treaty discussions at the UN. The impacts are going to get to us because of the interconnectivity of oceans. So again, this speaks to CARICOM governance and us working together to ensure that the transboundary issues do not negatively affect us. There was, interestingly enough, in the there was a pledge from AIR, which is an institution that with Adidas, where they're proposing to use recycled ocean plastic into the production of athletic shoes, and to repurpose and redesign and recycle, which of course is a very good initiative. That's a very welcome one in the Caribbean, where plastics is really a huge problem. It encourages innovation and biotechnology, as I mentioned, marine genetic resources. And of course, there's on the right here, there's, everyone knows the sargassum algae that is in the Caribbean now since 2011. We actually have an entrepreneur in Yohanan Dujon, a solution entrepreneur who is using it to make these organic liquid fertilizer. So it was used as an example in the Grenada document, of course, showing innovation, biotechnology, how we can move forward with using some in new areas of the blue sector and the ecosystem, really. And really, again, just as when you look from afar, it's looking, and I keep going back to how do we balance it? So how do you balance a mixed use area, then where you have the harbor, the cruise ship terminal, then you have the fishing village. As you can see in this composite, this is the redevelopment concept. And then you see the Grenada National Sports Center. These are really quite close in proximity. So as you would expect, there would be conflicts. There would be conflicts when you have a huge cruise ship coming in. There would be a conflict with your small fishing village. So on paper, it looks ideal, but as you can imagine, in reality, it's probably not going to work. So at the end of the day, it was a very ambitious plan. And of course, I would say reasonably successful. The plan that Grenada adopted emphasized oceans as natural capital, which is of course perfectly fine. Oceans as livelihoods, oceans as drivers of innovation, and we saw that from the scientific research. But I've highlighted oceans as good business simply because this is not what we really want to be promoting in the Caribbean, in CARICOM SIDS, or in the Pacific SIDS. It is not that the ocean is open for any business. That's really going to be very counterproductive. We're going to throw sustainable, we're going to throw environmental impacts, we're going to throw ecosystems out the window if we continue along that path. Some of the comments have been in terms of whether it was a success or not. A lot of local people felt there was not effective engagement because, as you saw in the slide before, you are fundamentally transforming the coastline of Grenada as nationals would have known it. Surely there would be the impacts on the population, the impacts on the key users. Nationals were concerned about how do you balance the sort of specifics of each of these activities in such a confined and in such a small space spatially. So there was concern about whether the coastal and marine ecosystems were in fact going to be super negatively affected because of this increase in activity. And of course, there was consideration, comments about if you're investing in a lot of these in vulnerable coastal areas that already climate change impacted negatively, could there be alternatives for consideration? So it really was, there was a lot of conversation, and at the moment, that's where I think the plan is. In moving forward, I emphasize that I really.
Oh, I just don't mean to interrupt, but I know Professor McDowell is to leave, so I just wanted to give him.
Sure. And this is actually the last slide. We need to have thinking of transformative thinking and integrated actions to make the blue economy in the Caribbean and small island states more inclusive, more productive, and more sustainable. So I'm going to leave it there and make it more Caribbean centered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gobin. And I know we only have about 10 minutes. Thank you so much for that case study. I think it really brought to light some of the inherent sort of difficulties in balancing all of these, various considerations as we think about sustainably developing our blue economies.
Yeah, just some final remarks, I guess, to say thank you to all of our speakers today. I think it's been a fantastic start to what is set to be a great week. As Jan said, we've got some great speakers coming up this week. I think you can have a look. Hopefully I've shared the document in the chat function there, so you can see the schedule for the week and some suggested reading. So we'll see you again here tomorrow at 9 a.m. And 2 p.m, depending on where you are in the world or whatever time it may be. And we'll send a reminder out tonight so you've got the details. But thank you everyone for coming along. It's great to have so many people here to talk so passionately about a crucial subject. And I think it's great to hear the examples from small island developing states and how they've experienced the blue economy and trade, and it'll be interesting to move forward with the discussions this week. So thank you very much.